Tell Conrad it's funny. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's debate. An important topic, and I'm glad that we have as many folks here tonight for our inaugural event, an event hopefully that we'll do in many years to come. My name is Conrad Hack, and I'm director of the speech and debate team, aka the forensics team here at Concordia University. You're going to see four of our very finest debaters talk about an important and even difficult topic tonight. Unlike a lot of the presidential debates that you might see where there's not really much argument going on, you're going to see some people agree, and you're going to see a lot of disagreement. And you'll see what I hope will be a genuine debate on the issues. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask Mrs. Amanda Ozaki-Lawhon, who's spearheaded this event, to come down and conduct the rest of the time. Amanda is a magna cum laude graduate of Concordia University in History and Political Thought. She was one of the top 3 placers in the President's Academic Showcase her senior year, was the only 8-0, along with her partner Richard Ewell, at the National Parliamentary Debate Association National Tournament, we had a tough topic in quarterfinals of the national tournament, but clearly one of the best debaters in the country last year. She has a passion for this topic, and so rather than continuing on, I'd like to introduce you to our co-director of debate here at the university, Amanda Ozaki.
Hi, everybody. It's so wonderful to see all of you. Like Conrad said, my name is Amanda. I'm co-director here of debate at Concordia. Basically, what started this kind of topic and talking about human trafficking, my sophomore year, I became president of the Anti-Human Trafficking Club on campus called Live to Free, and that topic has continued on, and it's become an event that's happening in April 16th on Concordia's campus called Eyes to See, Daring to Care About Human Trafficking in Southern California. And it's basically a bunch of churches from Los Angeles to San Diego that are all meeting at Concordia University on that day to discuss different ways to combat human trafficking. We have the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force that's coming on campus, and a bunch of other organizations, Courage House International, and Run to Rescue, which works out of Fullerton and Riverside, that are coming onto campus. So basically, this is a run-up event for that kind of campaign that's happening in April. Let me introduce you to our debaters. We have on the government team who's going to be defending the resolution. The resolution is the United States federal government should substantially increase pressure on Thailand to end forced labor. So we're going to be talking about international forced labor and modern-day slavery. This is our government team that will be defending that resolution. Manoa Martin is your prime minister, your first and last speaker of the debate. Judith Taruya is your member of government who will be speaking in the middle. And then we have our opposition team who will be opposing the resolution. The leader of opposition, Luke Marvin, will be your first negative speaker. And then your member of opposition will be Brandon Winchell. All 4 of these debaters, I've known them for multiple years, knew them in high school, all great, fantastic debaters, and so we should be having a great debate tonight. So with that, let's give it up for Manoa.
All good? All right. Shima Tao, an 11-year-old girl from Burma, dreamed of a better life and was overjoyed to receive an offer of employment from a shrimp processing facility in Thailand. When she arrived, she, along with hundreds of others, were locked in a prison-like facility, her documentation confiscated, and she was ordered to work. In the months that followed, she was beaten, abused, and threatened with physical exploitation. It is because we believe that such policies have been made possible because of failure in the U.S. federal government's actions, we would urge you to stand with the resolution in today's debate that the United States federal government should significantly increase pressure on Thailand to decrease forced labor. We believe that the way the status quo has modeled its trade policies to Thailand has made it advantageous for human traffickers to engage in practices of forced labor because it increases their bottom line. When they're able to use forced labor, they're able to enact policies that make their product very cheap and very accessible on the international market because it doesn't cost a lot to make. The course of advocacy that we would propose in this debate is that the United States federal government should ban all shrimp imports from Thailand to the United States until it meets the minimum standards under the Trafficking in Persons Report in combination with all tier-specific sanctions. So essentially what our plan does is says we're not going to import the shrimp products which are made by forced labor in Thailand in the world of our plan because to take a stand against that and to ensure that we do not provide a profit incentive for those individuals to continue the practices of forced labor. There are 4 specific reasons why we believe our plan is the best way to combat forced labor. The first is that the Trafficking in Persons Report is an effective tool of the State Department in actually decreasing forced labor. The State Department reports that the Trafficking in Persons Report places each country onto one of 3 tiers based on the extent of their government's efforts to comply with the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. A Tier 1 ranking indicates that a government complies with those minimum standards. The second reason our plan will work is that there's experts who support our plan and suggest this is the best method to decrease the forced labor in Thailand. According to the Environmental Justice Foundation, in 2013, the international community should actively consider trade embargoes on Thai shrimp in the absence of evidence that action is being taken to combat forced labor, highlighted in the 2013 Trafficking in Persons Report. The third reason you should support our plan is specifically the idea that our plan would create a decrease in trafficking because it creates a profit incentive for individuals who conduct acts of forced labor to stop the policies that they have promoted. Thailand is the source of 1/3 of all shrimp imported by the United States, this year generating over $1 billion in income. The U.S. consumes 46% of Thailand's total shrimp exports, which means we are the #1 place where they sell their shrimp, which is created through products of forced labor. This is important because if you use that United States incentive, if we take away that money and take away that support, we create an incentive for those those individuals who control the forced labor facilities to stop using those practices because they lose over $1 billion of U.S. money. According to Humanity United in 2013, the U.S. supply chain is clearly linked to sources in Thailand where exploitive labor has been identified. U.S. importers may possess opportunities to assert purchasing power and influence over foreign exporters. Now, those complicated economic terms mean that because the U.S. buys so much shrimp from Thailand, we can use that purchasing power as a tool to instigate reforms. The final reason you should support our plan is that there is historical success for Thailand's government complying with international pressure in order to decrease human trafficking. Specifically, the United Nations Human Rights Committee in 2005 says the U.S. successfully used unilateral trade sanctions against Thailand to the tune of $165 million to force the government to amend and expand its coverage of patent law. While patent law is obviously a different human rights issue than labor trafficking, this evidence proves that in the past, Thailand's government has responded positively to economic pressures. The reason we urge you to support our plan is decreasing the forced labor that happens right now in Thailand. The Environmental Justice Foundation reports that they have documented reports of trafficking, confiscation of identification documents, withholding of pay, forced detention, and bonded labor. Inside the shrimp factories in Thailand, there are thought to be more than 400,000 migrant workers from Burma alone. More than 1/3 had been trafficked into forced labor. The report goes on to say that the lack of registration and regulation leaves those employed in this sector particularly vulnerable to labor and human rights violations. Approximately 10,000 migrant children aged 13 to 15 are in the pre-processing facilities in Thailand. Further evidence suggests that U.S. demand for shrimp is only making the abuses worse. Hannah Hinstrom with the Democratic Voice of Burma in 2013 says Western demand for Thai-produced shrimps is fueling an epidemic of abuses, including child and forced labor. Thailand uses trafficking as an inherent part of its economic model in order to secure higher profits, while Western companies continue to look the other way. It's been said that all that is needed to triumph is for good people to stand by and do nothing. The status quo ignores the slavery of thousands, and in that act, becomes as guilty as those who perpetrate it. Our plan, by banning shrimp from Thailand, we condemn those abuses and suggest will lead to freedom for thousands of people. This action will not only protect innocent human life, but also end exploitive labor. The Economist in 2013 says at sea in the shrimping fleets, of 49 migrant fishermen interviewed, 29 said they had witnessed skippers murdering crewmen when they were too weak or sick to work. It goes on to say that in the cavernous shrimp peeling sheds of Thailand, observers have documented instances of workers suffering physical abuse, remaining unpaid, and having their papers confiscated. In Thailand, nearly 3/5 of workers experience conditions of forced labor. Because of its compulsive nature, forced labor dehumanizes individuals by violently imposing abusive working conditions and should not be condoned by U.S. policy. It's too late for Shima, who had her life destroyed through the abuses of labor trafficking. But it isn't too late for the thousands of men, women, and children still alive in Thailand's peeling sheds and shrimping fleets. They may be unable to take a stand against the human rights abuses of the industry, but today you have an opportunity to stand for them. Thank you. Oh yeah, there's crossings. Here or there. There. Right. Yeah.
There we go.
On button usually works.
On button always works. Okay, so first of all, exactly how many of the migrants that, or workers rather, that are in the shrimping industry in Thailand are there through trafficking?
They're through trafficking. Well, all of them have been trafficked in one form or another, but 2/3 are individuals who are there who went to get a job. 1/3 were individuals who were kidnapped or literally forced by individuals, by the captors, to be in those shrimping fleets.
Okay, now let's talk about the migrants that you spotlight. You specifically talk about Burma and how in Burma there's about 400,000 workers in Burma that are now in the Thailand shrimping industry that are being trafficked, correct?
Yes.
Okay, now are you aware that a large reason, maybe the main reason for why those migrants migrated from Burma to Thailand in the first place was due to poverty?
Absolutely. The way in which the traffickers use poverty as a mechanism to get individuals is deplorable. It's not only
Okay.
poverty, they use things like human rights abuses. They tell individuals this is the only solution for your family. There's a host of reasons why individuals are forced into labor trafficking, and poverty is one of the primary reasons that happens.
So you're saying traffickers exploit impoverished people in their impoverished circumstances?
That is correct.
Awesome. Let's go down to your, well, that's actually tragic, but we'll be getting to that in a second for why that's probably a point.
more?
Fair enough. On your harm specifically, you have a couple of arguments. So you specifically talk about how you're going to uphold them to these tier standards. Now, are the tier standards, what are the tier standards? Is this something that the government has to do, or is this something that the shrimping industries themselves have to regulate?
Well, our plan has two components to it. The first is the government aspect, and the second is the private sector aspect.
Okay.
The government aspect is where the government is held accountable to the tier standards, which question how the government is acting to combat trafficking.
Okay, let me stop you right there for a second. What incentive do you give their government to comply when all of your sanctions are directed at their private businesses, not their government?
For the first reason, normative trade relations with the United States. When your government is being spotlighted by the United States as a massive perpetuator of human rights, not only does that mean we're not trading with you, that means other countries look at that and say they don't want to do profit, don't want to do trade with Thailand because the United States says so. That's going to be a major incentive for them to want to do things that promote trade with other countries.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Turn it off.
Good evening, everyone. It has been said that the road to hell has paved with good intentions, and policymakers would be wise to keep this in mind as they craft policy. Such is the case with my opponent's proposal in today's debate to end the trafficking industry in Thailand by banning all of our imports of their shrimp. My partner and I believe that the affirmative method would cause more harm in its implementation and thus is not the best proposal. The first objection that we will argue here is that of poverty. We believe that poverty is the root cause of why there is trafficking in the first place. And if the affirmative in any way increases poverty, they will actually lead to a greater amount of trafficking in people than we are actually seeing right now. The Asian Development Bank statistics show that poverty in Thailand is about 11% in 2013. The affirmative sanctions would target the shrimp industry, and the shrimp industry in particular is along the coastlines of Thailand. People in these areas already have a high level of poverty because they do not necessarily have as many economic opportunities. There are a couple things that you should notice about their proposal. First, that it's indiscriminate. They do not target particular companies to ban shrimp from. Rather, they ban all shrimp. What this means is that even a small fisherman who gets literally shrimp from the ocean and tries to sell it on the international market is now going to lose half of his business at least, which means that he's going to be put out of business. Eliminating the trade would devastate local economies. The coastal cities of Thailand largely rely on fishing entirely, which means that these economies will disappear and those people will be plunged into poverty. But more importantly, roughly 2/3 of Thailand's entire GDP comes from exports. Exports primarily of seafood, of which shrimp represents a major part of that. About 90% of all of their shrimp produce is exported to international markets in the United States, the European Union, and Japan. What this means is your innocent small businessman or fisher who gets shrimp now is not going to be able to export this, and those families are going to now be devastated. The Brookings Institution argues that sanctions can have the perverse effect of bolstering authoritarian regimes and increasing the level of statism in a society. By creating scarcity, they enable governments to keep hold of scarce resources and control the distribution of goods. The danger is both moral in that innocents are effective, and it leads to a contrary effect of what the affirmative is actually trying to get at, in that it actually increases the level of trafficking. The reality is that trafficking exists in Thailand because people are so poor that they sell their their children even to try and put food on the table. In particular, the United Nations identifies that if we add a decrease in poverty, that would actually be able to decrease trafficking. We have also, though, seen the effects of economic sanctions in the case of Iran. The ban on Iranian oil directly led to the collapse of the Iranian economy, which affected individuals in the economy, but did not actually initiate policy change on a wide level in the government for years. When you look to the effect of sanctions in Iran, they had rapid double-digit inflation, which made it impossible for common people to get things like medicine and food. In particular, the price of vegetables increased about 30%, and overall things like chicken as well as other medicine increased over 100%. Particular medicines, which are common in the United States, saw 600% inflation rates, all because of this one sanction. What the effect was is that your people at the top, the people who control the levels of power and actually control what a nation's policy is, they were not affected. It was the common person, the working person, who was harmed. We also argue that according to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the common factors that actually made victims vulnerable to trafficking were migration. You might have noticed that Manoa talked about migrants being particularly vulnerable. Migration increases when poverty levels increase, as well as a lack of opportunity, which means if they increase any level of poverty along these coastal cities, more people are going to have to look for more opportunities, which is going to make them particularly vulnerable. Therefore, we propose that the United States takes a different option. We propose that the United States negotiates a trade deal with Thailand with worker protections and provisions. We believe there is good precedent for this. Most recently, we have been looking to the TPP as a good example of this. This is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement negotiated between multiple different Asian nations and the United States. It has some of the strictest levels of worker protections in history, including protections for unionization, collective bargainization rights, minimum wage standards, and flat-out bans on child labor. This will be far more enforceable if you look to the history of free trade agreements. In the case of NAFTA, which was negotiated between the United States and Mexico as well as Canada, there were actual oversight boards that were set up that went and examined factory conditions both in the United States and in Mexico to ensure that they were complying with the treaty. It also moves this issue to where it has to be resolved, which is at the governmental level. If we only target the industry, we're only going to be targeting people in terms of their wallet, but what is actually going to happen is they're not going to have a structural and institutional reform. The fact of the matter is that many of the trafficked victims have reported that the government has betrayed them and that police officers oftentimes sell them back to the brokers who sold them in the first place. So even if they are able to collapse these shrimping industries, if they do not resolve the governmental corruption, they are not going to be able to resolve trafficking. We will additionally argue, though, that free trade offers more incentives for reform than sanctions. First of all, free trade agreements will generate more bottom-up growth in these nations. Free trade agreements have been shown to increase the level of growth in developing nations, according to UN statistics, as well as the Minneapolis Federal Reserve in 2016 just actually made a report that was just reported on by Forbes that one of the best ways to reduce poverty in developing nations is to have more free trade agreements, which means that we actually are able to address the root cause of the problem with the free trade agreement. But additionally, it means that at an institutional level and a legal level, we address the problem of trafficking, which is that these traffickers are not being put behind bars because you have police officers who are corrupt and are willing to basically take bribes in order to leave these victims in their situation. Additionally, though, the free trade agreement method also means that these individuals, there's actually more growth incentives for the government to actually keep this more trade flowing in, which increases their revenue. And ultimately means that at the executive level, they will force through initiatives to decrease trafficking. The problem with the affirmatives case here is it has a good intention, but it's going to put people in poverty because they will lose their business. And if they put people in poverty, they're going to make them more vulnerable to trafficking.
All right. How are you this evening? Sole How are those types of policies going to be enforced in a country which you've identified has a massively corrupt government?
Because there's no political will in the system right now to enforce reforms on the local levels with police institutions. The executive level of the Thailand government has not tried to enforce any anti-corruption measures or in any initiatives.
Okay, and do you have any statement from Thailand's government, any reason why Thailand would specifically comply with your sanctions in order to decrease human trafficking?
The United States, with its State Department, has been pretty effective in forcing other nations to agree with our free trade agreement proposals.
But
We've seen this with the case of NAFTA and others. Well, I would argue the United States hasn't tried, so it's kind of hard to say.
I think there's a pretty clear signal this is over. I think that they don't want us talking anymore. You know, I'm sorry, man. Did we say something wrong?
It's hard to know what Thailand's response would be because the United States hasn't made this a top issue.
Sure. All right. Thank you very much for your time.
Imagine 16-foot-high barbed wire-capped walls with an armed guard fence surrounding a factory that looks more like a prison than a complex for industrial productivity. The National Australian University published a report in 2013 of their investigations into the forced labor atrocities that were occurring in Thailand's shrimping industry. What they found was that Workers, hundreds of workers, were trapped inside a compound, living under filthy conditions, forced to work long hours, sometimes exceeding 20 hours per day, and subject to physical and emotional abuse. Most of the workers were Burmese migrants who relayed shocking stories of their time within these factories. Some of the workers said that if they made a simple mistake on the shrimp peeling line, asked to take sick leave, or were simply trying to go home for the day, that they could be subject and expected to be beaten, molested, and publicly tortured. We cannot ignore the problems evident within Thailand's labor forces and the way Western markets, particularly the United States, has condoned and perpetuated these atrocities. When we look to the fact that 2/3 of Thailand's unregistered workers and more than 1/2 of their registered workers have felt some type of human or labor trafficking, the affirmative believes that we need to stand resolved for the United States to take an ethical stand against the forced labor that is currently going on in Thailand's shrimping industry. The first contention that the negative team proposes is that sanctions are actually not a good way to do this, and that in fact they are going to lead to more poverty. My first response is going to be that poverty only occurs in a world where the United States is implicit with labor trafficking and does not put punishments on the perpetuators of the forced labor conditions. They say that they cite all these examples of how in Iran sanctions led to an increase in poverty. However, my first response is they deny all of the empirics that we've proven from the first speech, saying how when Thailand specifically had a trade embargo on it in regards to the shrimping industry, that Thailand responded effectively. The reason being is because the United States is Thailand's #1 market for their shrimping industry. So when you place that financial burden upon the Thai government, they have no choice but to respond to the United States and our Tier 1 standards for human trafficking and for forced labor. But when we look to the fact that not only in the instance that we gave you in the first speech, but back also in the 1990s when the United States once again placed a second embargo on Thailand's shrimping industry because they were failing to meet standards to protect endangered species within the ocean, surrounding ocean, Thailand within a few months of the trade embargo once again complied with the United States environmental protection standards. There's only been historical precedent to show and favor that Thailand will respond to economic pressures. But the next argument they go for is that there is this counter proposal that free trade agreements with Thailand are going to be able to resolve better. Now the question in this debate comes down to whether it is a carrot method or a stick method, whether or not we are using economic sanctions to punish Thailand for their complicity within human trafficking and forced labor, or whether or not we are going to incentivize them to change. But the counter position that the negative proposes is simply not going to work. First of all, because they simply don't go far enough. Their trade protection policies within this free trade agreement do nothing to solve the issue of the Thai government being complicit within the workers and the shrimping industry's atrocities that they are allowed to commit. They themselves have acknowledged that there's immense corruption within the government and the police force, and how they have taken numerous bribes and ignored the fact that shrimpers are kidnapping thousands of individuals from Cambodia, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Laos, and bringing them and forcing them to stay and work within the shrimping industry in Thailand. That corruption is not going to be able to resolve anything under the affirmative plan because they don't stop or punish those actions. All they do is expand the market and provide a new outlet for the human traffickers to have a new industry to bring more workers in. So all we're going to see after the vote for the negative team is an increase in the forced labor and the atrocities that occur. But additionally, they tried to say that free trade agreements address the legal and structural issues. However, there's two problems with this. First of all, if political will is simply going to be changed because the United States is imposing some sort of standards, that also works both ways, because that is similar to what the affirmative is doing. We're imposing a standard as well. But additionally, either political will is going to be able to change by the United States, or it's never going to happen, which means that this works for the affirmative team as well. But then they go down to talk about how there's more the structural issues and how they're going to be able to resolve because they have these oversights that the free trade agreement has. They're going to send United States individuals into Thailand to make sure that they are supporting the correct standards, labor standards, and they're not treating their workers horribly. However, the Department of Labor found that an average time it took for these oversight inspections to occur was 9 months. There is a 9-month period of time that the negative team allows for individuals to continue to be trafficked, for individuals to continue to be forced to work in these horrible environment because the Department of Labor is backlogged. The Department of Labor can't keep up with the number of inspections they need to do. So the negative team only provides a scenario for more individuals to remain in the horrible conditions that they currently are. The only proposal that there is that is going to be able to do anything to get these individuals out of the conditions that they're in is the affirmative team. We have given you empirical examples of how Thailand themselves, specifically to Thailand, the country we're talking about, how they have responded to the type of economic pressures the affirmative is using previously, and they have been successful. We have also given you statistics about how the human trafficking in persons report has been immense success at spotlighting human trafficking issues as well as forced labor issues and being able to lead to the resolution of those horrible conditions, which means that the only way to be able to effectively change the horrible and conditions and atrocities that Thailand's shrimping industry is committed is by enforcing hard economic sanctions and punishments upon the traffickers and upon the government who has been complicit in this. The affirmative makes Thailand responsible and accountable for their complacency with the human rights abuses. The affirmative is the only way to be able to resolve this question.
Politics. We have most everyone on my right and then Keith on the left. But with that said, I'm going to find a convenient place to put this. I know. I try. Okay. Tonight's debate is a very simple one. Both teams in today's debate agree that trafficking is a bad issue. This is a methods debate. What is the best way to alleviate trafficking? Implementing sanctions that increase poverty, which is the root cause of why people are coerced into trafficking in the first place, or offering a free trade agreement with a carrot type compelling so that the government of Thailand will be able to crack down on the type of trafficking that's happening on by removing the coercion within the police department and by reducing trafficking overall that we have seen in other countries such as the TPP. We believe that this is a simple solution because never increasing the root cause of poverty through sanctions is never going to bring about the results that they spotlight, that they compel in the 1AC. With that said, let's look at the arguments that were brought up, starting with the issues of poverty. Now, they talk about how this is only going to be about different actors and that we should be looking about whether or not they're going to comply with the sanctions. But my response is that the sanctions are always going to be causing poverty. Let's look at an article that was published from the Heritage Foundation today. Too bad it wasn't USA Today. I could have made a joke out of that. It says, quote, "The Index of Economic Freedom consistently finds that free markets and entrepreneurship are keys to prosperity and reports a significant positive correlation between higher economic freedom and reduced poverty. Poverty and lack of economic opportunities are two of the most important factors that heighten vulnerability to trafficking. Therefore, an important step to take in the fight against trafficking is to reduce ineffective foreign aid programs and promote trade." This analysis, again from today from the Heritage Foundation, is spotlighting the thesis of the opposition team. If you want to reduce trafficking, reduce poverty, which is the main reason why these people are forced from Bermuda and other countries to migrate into a dangerous situation. My opponents went on to say that specifically Thailand reacted well to sanctions in the past. Well, first of all, my opponents have conceded the fact that Thailand's poverty rate is astoundingly high right now with an 11% unemployment rate. The sanctions in the past are what caused the economic situation of today, which is why Thailand has such incredibly high trafficking rates in the status quo. Furthermore, though, patent law is hardly akin to the type of sanctioning that they're talking about, and here's why. With patenting law, they put pressure on the federal government. The federal government can comply because there's nothing they lose. However, according to the State Department analysis that they researched, the federal government in Thailand right now, whenever an immigrant who is an enslaved immigrant escapes, The federal government sees them, captures them, and sells them back to the traffickers, which means the federal government of Thailand has an economic incentive to not put on stricter sanctions and to not respond to my affirmative plan. Now, you may be asking, well, why then is your counter-alternative of free trade a better idea? And that is because of the ceiling of economic opportunity. You see, with sanctions, you can only remove so much. You can only remove 100% at most of what you're giving. But with a free trade agreement, there's no ceiling, there's no limit of how much free trade we can offer Thailand to help decrease the type of poverty. Furthermore, free trade agreements typically lower the poverty and increases wages, as we've spotlighted, and we've seen success with other countries such as the TPP and with South Korea, and how our KORUS agreement with South Korea helped reduce some of the crimes there as well. Additionally, I'd like to point out alternatively that when they talk about how they're going to force Thailand's hand, and they say we're going to put these sanctions on and they're not going to have a choice, according to the Associated Press, what happens, unfortunately, is that these trafficking industries, you think they're going to take a big hit to their shrimp industry. That's true. But instead of complying, what they instead do is take the workers they have and sell them off into the sex trafficking trade industry. You don't solve the problem, you only shift it. The only way to solve the problem is to get at the heart or the root cause of the issue, which once again is poverty. Now ask yourself this: do sanctions increase or decrease poverty? Pretty simple answer. They increase. Does a free trade agreement increase or decrease poverty? It decreases poverty. It brings more trade and more economic growth to those countries by removing tariffs and allowing their products to be sold on the free and open market. Therefore, when we're looking at the root cause of the issue, the only question you have to ask yourself at the end of the debate round is which team is controlling access to the economy? Which team is best alleviating and improving the economy? They have completely ignored our Iranian empirics of when we put sanctions in Iran, we saw that we were hurting the average person who couldn't get medical treatment. When we put sanctions in Iraq, 500,000 people died. 500,000 children due to our sanctions that we implemented on Iraq. There is no such thing as a targeted sanction. Sanctions hurt everybody, and they only increase the poverty, increase the problem, increase trafficking. Move down to their arguments where they talk about how this is going to be able to change the political will, and that if the government's so corrupt, they're not going to have an incentive. Once again, the government is going to have more of an incentive to a free trade agreement than a sanction. We've seen Iran. Sanctions don't work. We've seen North Korea. Sanctions don't work. They talk about Thailand in the past, but those sanctions only increase poverty. So even if you want to believe that Thailand's government may respond positively to sanctions, you are still increasing poverty immediately because you sever off the trade, which means you're always going to be causing more economic conditions, hurting more people, forcing more into the trafficking industry. That is not a solution that is acceptable for the negative team. Additionally, talk about how the State Department is overran right now, but they would have to also have the State Department would have to see the regulations for their side as well, so it's really a wash issue. In closing, I'd simply like to read the final statement that was read in this report from the Heritage Foundation released today, where it says, the United States should promote economic freedom as a cornerstone of anti-trafficking efforts. Apart from this, U.S. programming will fail to address some of the main drivers of human trafficking. The economy is what drives human trafficking. The affirmative team decreases the economy, hurts the average person, put them in a desperate situation to be exploited. Only the negative team with a free trade agreement could alleviate that type of problem. Thank you. I do have a mic. Now I have to turn it off. Sorry. Wow.
Here's what this debate comes down to. Whoever can resolve poverty is going to resolve trafficking. The affirmative has not shown that their plan is going to be able to resolve poverty, which means even if they collapse the shrimp industry in Thailand for the now, they are not going to solve for poverty, they are not going to solve for trafficking, which means all of those victims have a propensity to be trafficked again, as well as for trafficking to continue for other individuals. And that is the crux of the issue. If they cannot solve for poverty, they cannot solve for these victims. A World Bank study found that over the past 30 years, the extreme poverty rate level has declined significantly. Extreme poverty was defined as $1.25 a day, and it declined from 1 out of 2 to 1 out of 5. This has been attributed to free trade. The increase in free trade agreements around the world, the breaking down of trade barriers, the leveling of the playing field for economic players around the world is why people can eat and survive on more than $1.25 a day. And this is the best way to resolve the poverty in Thailand. This is the best way to prevent trafficking. This is the best way to decrease the need for migration, which is how these people became vulnerable to traffickers in the first place. If we do not address the root cause of these problems, then any solution is going to be temporary and is inevitably going to fail. Now, my opponent is going to talk about how child abuse and child labor is horrific, and they can talk about these horrific stories, but here's the issue. If they eliminate all the shrimp trade with the United States, they are going to collapse the local economies. They are going to eliminate all the innocent shrimp businesses. They are going to eliminate people who rely on the shrimp businesses, the shipbuilder, the net builder. Everyone is going to be harmed by these sanctions regardless of whether or not they are actually responsible for the trafficking. What this means is they put more individuals into poverty, more individuals who have to sell their children, more individuals who have to migrate. As the UN pointed out, poverty is why these people migrate, and that means they will be vulnerable to other traffickers. Additionally, a ban on the export would likely lead to these companies selling off the previously trafficked victims because now they're not going to be making as much of an export. If it's true that they decrease the export potential for these businesses by 46%, which is what they identified, they will likely sell off these workers that they have, which means they're not going to be able to solve for it. The only way to solve for these individuals is if the government of Thailand cracks down on trafficking. That is why we need a free trade agreement and an incentive system for Thailand to actually crack down on these corrupt police officers, corrupt localities, and corrupt businesses. The example of Iran illustrates this. Governments don't care unless it directly impacts them. If it impacts a sector of the economy or if it impacts a select few individuals in the economy, the government doesn't care. It's not until it actually impacts the top executive level of the government, especially in the case of Thailand, which is much more authoritarian, as is the case with Iran. That is when a government will actually take action. And that is why we have not seen action in Thailand, because the top levels of government have not had to take issue. So if the United States starts making this an issue, starts giving incentives for the Thailandese, and starts having the State Department diplomats get over there in their face on this issue, that will resolve this better than if we just ban all shrimp imports. My opponents have not shown that they could reduce poverty. The free trade agreement has been shown to reduce poverty. The free trade agreement would likely solve the affirmative problem and this problem of trafficking better than the affirmative proposal. The debate should be about not who can best collapse the shrimp industry, but who can best solve poverty, because that will provide a lasting solution that will provide the social structure for which these people can actually develop and provide food for their children rather than selling their children into slavery, which is why we have so much trafficking right now. Which means the free trade agreement is far superior to banning all shrimp imports.
We all ready? Child labor and poverty are inevitably bound together, and if you continue to use the labor of children as a treatment for the social disease of poverty, you will have both poverty and child labor till the end of time. That quote by Grace Abbott sums up the philosophy of the affirmative. The idea that throwing more money at the problem and giving a bigger carrot for the traffickers to fix the problem is all of a sudden going to make human trafficking and labor trafficking go away is false. It's empirically denied. It hasn't happened in the past. The fact is, we're giving over $1 billion to traffickers right now because we don't care. People in America are fine buying products that are made using forced labor, and that hasn't solved the problem. The idea of giving more money to traffickers as a way to make their hearts feel good to stop doing trafficking is not the correct way to approach this policy. We have to take a punishmental approach and say that they have already put over 400,000 individuals into forced labor. That's unacceptable. They need to pay the price, not get a raise. Under their arguments when they talked about poverty, they specifically talked about the Heritage Foundation argument, talking about how sanctions have historically shown an increase of poverty. The Heritage Foundation argument doesn't think that targeted sanctions exist, but the Heritage Foundation argument hasn't seen our plan, apparently. The targeted sanctions implemented in the plan are not mass swath government regulations on the government. They're not sanctions toward the entire economy. They are sanctions on the individuals who own specific industries within Thailand's seafood shrimp industry, which means this is not a broadly effective sanction. This is a sanction on a specific problem that we are trying to solve. I'd like you to note that it's interesting the negative talks about how important it is to decrease the question of poverty, but the workers aren't getting paid right now. All of that money goes to the traffickers. So any decrease in poverty that we'd see post-plan, it's money taken out of human trafficker and labor traffickers' profits because they're the one that gets the $1 billion in the status quo. It's not $1 billion that's going to individuals in poverty right now. It's money going to individuals who put them into poverty. They're not getting paid. So the idea that we're going to throw thousands of individuals into poverty post-plan is not accepting of the facts and does not in any way take into any account the way in which money goes into the trafficking industry and the status quo. Their argument is that Thailand is going to see an increase in poverty by our plan because we did sanctions in the past and they have poverty now, so the two must be correlated. That's a logical fallacy. But first of all, I'd like to point out those sanctions were lifted. Those sanctions weren't there. We implemented the sanction and said if you do not do this policy that we want you to do, fixing the shrimp industry, fixing the patent law, if you don't fix that, we're going to sanction you. They responded, the sanction was lifted, and then the poverty rate never happened because they never saw the decrease in trade. That's how a sanction works. We implement the sanction till we get what we want, and then we raise the sanction. Thailand doesn't have a problem with poverty if they don't do forced labor. As soon as forced labor practices go away, the sanction lifts, and that $1 billion market is back open for sale, which means there is no propensity for the affirmative to be able to cause this type of trafficking that the negative team has identified. They talk about how the trafficking individuals are going to sell people into sex trafficking. That's the status quo. Individuals are being physically exploited now in the labor camps, and that's why we need to take action against that. But I'd also like to point out that the tier system used within the affirmative plan is able to solve that because the tier system isn't just about labor trafficking, it's also about sex trafficking. So the government's not going to get fooled if all of a sudden the individuals who are in labor trafficking simply get sold into another industry. The tier system takes into account that, which means there's no propensity for these individuals to be forced into those industries. Under the negative team's counter-proposal, they think that a free trade agreement is the best way to resolve the question of labor trafficking in Thailand, but we'd suggest the negative really isn't all that imaginative or creative. It's been done before. We've given you a number of examples where we've done free trade agreements in the past, like the NAFTA free trade agreement, and there's still 1.2 million individuals in forced labor. The Central American Free Trade Agreement, 1.8 million individuals still in forced labor. The point is, these types of policies don't decrease forced labor, they enable it because they create a larger market and more money for individuals to be able to access. You'd also find it interesting that if it really is true that trade decreases things like human trafficking and labor, you ought to think our number one trading partner, China, would have a spotless human rights record. To the contrary, China is on the Tier 2 watch list and hosts over 500,000 individuals in forced labor. The idea that we create labor standards to stop individuals from conducting forced labor is false. A, we can't enforce them, and B, we don't enforce them because that's a way for our consumers at home to make money. The idea of creating a carrot and an incentive for individuals to stop doing bad things doesn't work. It hasn't worked in the past, and it's not going to work now. The only way to decrease the question of labor trafficking is to take it to the traffickers. They lose money if you vote for our plan, $1 billion. These aren't workers. They're not getting paid. It's the individuals who are padding their wallets off the backs of slaves. That's what our plan is trying to solve, and that's why we'd urge you to vote for it. Thank you. Nice debate. I can see this. Nice job.
Oh, thank you so much for being with us with some of those technical difficulties. But let's give one more hand to our great debaters for a great debate. So I know we have some family members in the audience, but it wouldn't be fun to go without a vote at the end of the debate. So we're going to do a kind of like a raising hands vote on which side you think won. But before we do that, if you have any questions for our debaters, go ahead and raise your hand. I have a mic right here, and if you want to ask them a question, they can answer with the lapel mic that I think you were still wearing. Any questions about the format of the debate, the things that they are researching and talking about in Thailand? They read a lot about this for like a year in high school debate or something, and they really wanted to talk about it. So if you have any questions, feel free. Questions? No? So, yeah, and all of this is going to be recorded online on the Eyes to See Facebook page. So if you have anyone that would be interested in, seeing this or something, then go ahead and share that with any family members, people that are interested. And if you're interested in joining the debate team, we have a rolling admission service. You can talk to myself or Conrad. We're walking around. I'm in Emendari drinking coffee all the time. So if you would like to join the debate team or you like what you see, we also have an IE speech team that does showcases as well. So feel free to come up to us and talk about possibly joining the team. We have scholarship opportunities, things like that are all really fun. Okay, so basically the bet that I made with our debaters is whoever wins tonight's debate gets the Stacks ice cream sandwiches on me tonight.
Stakes are high, guys.
Stakes are very high.
Super high.
So let's have hands raised if our negative team won today's debate. Okay, okay. All right, let's see hands raised if our affirmative team won today's debate. Okay, wow, it's really close, but it looks like a win for the affirmative team in today's debate round. So let's give them a hand. Yay! All right, feel free to mingle and everything, but thank you so much, everybody, for attending tonight. Have a good night.